Salutations! This video has been a while coming, but I'm here to review Germanic Theology by Tristan Powers, published by Imperium Press. Before we get into it, there was some controversy when the book released about a leak of the PDF, so I would like to assure both Mr. Powers and Mr. Press that I purchased a physical copy. With that out of the way, what is this book about? Well, what it definitely isn't about is theology.
What?
What this book actually is a commentary on the Poetic Edda, with a focus on explaining the cultural, historical, and linguistic details that may be lost on a modern English reader. Insofar as it is that, it is actually quite good.
This is based...
I couldn't identify any serious issues with any of the etymologies or historical context provided, and I agreed with most of the identifications he makes between figures both within the Germanic corpus and between this and other mythologies. As such, I absolutely do recommend this book to anyone who wants a deeper and more detailed understanding of the Poetic Edda from a historical and linguistic perspective. I did notice a number of grammatical and spelling errors.
Just remember, Leahy, what comes around is all around.
Don't you mean what's all around comes around, Ricky?
And I think Mr. Imperium Press definitely needs to hire a better editor, or just hire an editor if he doesn't have one.
I just don't know how to express myself sometimes when I need to be properly different. Fuck.
On a similar note, some of the terminology found in the English translation that the author uses, and intends for this book to be a companion to, is referred to as obscure and archaic on numerous occasions, and he offers very awkward explanations of their meanings. Well, marry, nuncle, I ken you're mithered by barley tranquilments and can't blag them from your nels to your bonts on account of you being a yampy yank, me old mucker. In other words, I think this is just Mr. Powers being inordinately American.
Let's skin a possum!
Because I both hear and use many of these terms all the time, or at least often enough that none of it seemed unusual to me. In my local dialect we say out and nout rather than ought and naught.
What happened in 1776, Jeeves?
I prefer not to dwell on it if it's convenient to you, sir.
All this being the case, Mr. Powers does allude to theological claims in the course of the book, and theology is what I came here for. So I think we should examine these more closely and see what we can find. After all, Tristan Powers was previously an associate of Kerwin Rollinson's group Arya Akasha, who have done wonderful work in Indo-European comparative religion, so something of this may have rubbed off on Powers.
It was time to break out my genius.
Due to the nature of the book, I will not be going chapter by chapter, as each chapter covers a different poem from the Edda, rather than making some definite point or statement as the previous books I've reviewed have done. Instead, I'm just going to go through my notes and look at the most important or interesting examples. When we read of Ginnungagap, we are assured that because it is a place in the mythic cosmology, this means that it and everything in any way associated with the entire cosmology is manifest and incarnate, in other words corporeal, meaning that nothing transcendent can conceivably exist. Mr. Powers seems to be under the impression that a spatial location cannot possibly signify anything other than a spatial location, and supports this by showing us a place and telling us that it signifies a spatial location.
Oh yeah. It's all coming together.
This is called begging the question, and it is a logical fallacy. Nothing in the text implies this in itself. It is a conclusion that can only be reached by someone who presupposes it before reading. When the gods are seen to make and use tools, Mr. Powers insists that these must be actual material tools of the same type used by humans.
Christmas ornaments of the gods.
Once more, he is begging the question, and in a way that is counter to what we know of other myths and religions. The ancient Egyptians used objects such as weapons, scepters, staffs, etc. as symbols for the powers and personalities of the gods, as did the Greeks. Pausanias, whom I must remind certain people was not a philosopher at all, discusses the symbolism of the anthropomorphic depictions of gods in his book on geography. Pausanias makes no attempt whatsoever to justify this attitude, indicating that he did not expect anyone to even question this mode of interpretation. This is also the case for Hindu and Buddhist deities, according to their own texts. Unless you think that this bodhisattva literally flays people's skins off and her followers are only pretending it's symbolic. Moreover, Christians believe that their God spoke the universe into being with words, and yet here he is depicted measuring out the cosmos using tools. Does Mr. Powers think that the man who painted this image really believed that God used a massive compass to measure the world? Where is this compass now? Is it in a gigantic toolbox or shed?
By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
After saying all this, Mr. Powers makes no attempt whatsoever to explain the description of the sun and moon being drawn on chariots by deities. Is this supposed to be literal? The moon is moved by horses and not by gravity? How can this be reconciled with the fact that the Earth orbits the sun? It appears that Mr. Powers is being inconsistent and arbitrary. It is literal when he wants it to be, and when he doesn't, it's merely poetic flair or an unknowable mystery.
I mean, what is this?
In the fascinating section of Volaspur where the gods are said to have erected temples and altars, Mr. Powers tells us that this means the gods actually worship their own divinity at these sites. What does Powers mean by divinity? He doesn't say. What makes the divinity of the gods more worthy of worship than anything else, such as the power of the giants? He doesn't say.
Which is better?
There's only one way to find out.
When the theft of the mead of poetry is discussed, no interpretation or speculation occurs. I think I'm starting to notice a pattern in geriatric theosophy. The nature of this mead and its comparison with the Arwen of Celtic myth has enormous theological implications when it comes to divine inspiration and its relationship with poetry like that in the Poetic Edda. It is our understanding of this specific subject that underpins our ability to interpret the text as a whole, so if anything it is the most important part of the book to discuss, but Powers brushes past it as if it were incidental. At one point, Mr. Powers refers to Frigg and Freya as hypostases. What does this mean? He doesn't say. I'm sure he can't mean that they are the common foundational substrates of reality, which is what the word hypostasis actually means. On the identification of these goddesses, I agree with Tom Rousel.
He hates the poor and is very rude to women.
That they are entirely different, and Freya instead corresponds to the Anglo-Saxon Erstra or Easter and other Indo-European dawn goddesses.
It's a Sigma male.
Mr. Powers believes that there is textual confusion regarding the figure known as Dain, who is in one place an elf, in another a dwarf, and in yet another he is a deer. I don't think there is any confusion at all, nor any contradiction. Dwarfs are known to regularly appear in animal forms, such as Otter being an otter, and Fafnir being a serpent. There is no reason to think that the dwarf Dain can't be a deer. As for him being an elf, this is almost certainly due to elf being a generic term for spirit beings, much like Greek daimon, Arabic jinn, Celtic fairy, Chinese gui, or Japanese yokai. Mr. Powers follows Mr. Rollinson in his identification of Thunder with the Hindu deity Hanuman, based on Rig Veda 1086, where the thunder god Indra directly identifies himself with a monkey.
Monkey!
Alongside the primary features of Hanuman being his strength, use of a blunt striking weapon, and spiritual descent from the sky god Vata Vayu. Powers also produces a strong argument in favour of the Rig of Rigsthulla not actually being Heimdall as is usually understood, but rather Woden, though he is undecided on the matter, and so am I, though I lean more towards Heimdall. Mr. Powers points out the significance of the assumption of Asmegin, godly might, in which a deity assumes a greater form and seems to grow as tall as the sky.
You're a big guy.
For you.
Powers calls it an uncloaking of full divine power and eminence. However, the implications of this are not fleshed out. It seems to me to be evident that the gods as they manifest are expressions of superior unmanifest gods, nonetheless capable of channeling their higher selves to accomplish their ends when necessary. When we come to the scene in which Woden sacrifices himself on the tree, possibly the most iconic scene in all of Germanic mythology, we get a very basic and shallow interpretation. Mr. Powers believes that Woden has performed a feat in which he has gained control of his soul, allowing him to travel back and forth from death. If that is the case, then why doesn't he come back after being slain by the Fenris Wolf?
I'm back, baby!
Colin Cleary, in his essay What God Did Odin Worship?, attempts to understand this myth through comparison of Woden to his Indian equivalent Shiva. We at the Third Academy have been developing the interpretation of this scene through comparison to a Buddhist myth in which Chakrasamvara Heraka, a god whose iconography is almost identical to that of Shiva, destroys and then assumes the identity of the worldly Rudra.
Now, your regular god was busy, so he sent me instead.
The lesser is killed and subsumed into the greater, becoming a bridge between the higher and the lower. No matter how one looks at it, these are different levels or layered manifestations of the same entity, something which both the non-dualist Buddhists and the Advaita Shaivites readily concede, though they may argue about whose version is superior. In Platonic theology, we recognise there to be two primary manifestations of Jupiter prior to the mundane dodecad.
This is getting out of hand. Now there are two of them.
The first is the intellective Jupiter, the demiurge of wholes, who receives the intelligible essences from Saturn his father and produces the psychical cosmos as a whole unified living being. Suspended from him is the supermundane demiurgic triad, consisting of the brothers Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto. This triad divides up and distributes the unified realm established by Saturn, Jupiter being the cause of essence, Pluto of life, motion and generation, and Neptune of division and reversion. This of course corresponds to the successive overthrowing and castration of Kailas and Saturn in classical myth, the division of heaven and earth by Rudra in the Rig Veda, and the dismemberment of Yima by Woden and his two brothers in the Germanic corpus.
There is more truth in legend than in history.
And there's more salt in ham than in turkey.
Now, the myth of self-sacrifice may relate to these two Jupiters, or it may correspond to the killing of Bacchus, who subsists in Jupiter as the intellect of the material universe. I prefer the former, because the symbolism of the latter is already well established and would not provide insight into the nature of the runes which Woden receives from this sacrifice, whereas the former does by giving them an origin in the intellect. See this, Mr. Powers? This is the kind of thing I was looking for in germ theory.
Surely you can do better than that?
So if not here, where should you look for a dose of Germanic theology? Well, I thought I'd look through my books for some that go out of their way to establish theological positions and specifically refer to Germanic religion rather than polytheism in general.
Just for you, because I like you a lot.
Note that I don't necessarily agree with the theology in these books, but it's always beneficial to hear a range of perspectives on an issue. I already mentioned Colin Cleary's essay collection Summoning the Gods, which contains What God Did Odin Worship, which is crammed with interesting speculation and food for thought. I also have Asatru, a Native European Spirituality by Stephen McNallen, one of the founders of the modern Asatru movement. Chapter 4 is dedicated to who or what the gods are, attempting to establish their reality and their nature.
Oh, I think Thor is fabulous.
Hammer of the Gods by one Swain Wodening is a guide to Anglo-Saxon heathenry, which contains chapters explaining in detail the nature of holiness or sacredness and the parts of the soul. The same author has a more simple introductory work called Path to the Gods, which has a chapter addressing what the gods are. Zachary Gill, a friend of the Third Academy known online as Hammer and Vajra, has published several interesting and insightful books. The book called Understanding Indo-European Cosmology, Theology and Metaphysics has a lot to say on the Germanic sphere specifically. There is a chapter on the symbolism of Woden's death at Ragnarok, a chapter on Odic force, one on trolls, and one on comparing and contrasting the respective self-sacrifices of Woden and Christ with reference to the Heliand. The other chapters also relate extensively to Germanic theology from a comparative Indo-European perspective. I hope this has helped. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.